Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and it's good to be back, though I have returned apparently to an empty studio because I don't have a co-host today, but we do have some exciting guests for you coming up. I'll be speaking to investigative journalist Daniel Boguslaw about Donald Trump's Epstein problem, which seems to keep getting worse. Plus, I have an interview with filmmaker Petra Costa about her documentary on the Evangelical right in Brazil. Also, coming up tonight, the government is lowering the voting age to 16. Finally, a Keir Starmer policy. Am I excited about it? I'm pleased. Let's say I support it. And Diane Abbott has been suspended from the Labour Party for a second time. Stay tuned for all of that. Before we get started, a reminder that tickets are available for the next Downstream IRL event. Ash Sarkar will be speaking to William Dalrymple for a wide-ranging conversation about empire resistance and the long shadows of colonialism and Arabistani. And we'll be speaking to Josephine Quinn, one of Britain's most respected historians of antiquity. This is, I suppose, a follow-up to two very successful episodes of Downstream with a similar lineup. William Dalrymple, I'm sure there are many fans in the audience of this show, the people who listen to his Empire podcast. I should tell you how to get those tickets. They're in the description. It's at Earth Hackney on the 29th of July. At the end of a week where Donald Trump has been under growing pressure to release information pertaining to Jeffrey Epstein, the Wall Street Journal has dropped this bombshell. And so this is the headline. Jeffrey Epstein's friends sent him bawdy letters for a 50th birthday album. One of them was from Donald Trump. This is how the article starts. It was Jeffrey Epstein's 50th birthday, and Ghislaine Maxwell was preparing a special gift to mark the occasion. She turned to Epstein's family and friends. One of them was Donald Trump. Maxwell collected letters from Trump and dozens of Epstein's other associates for a 2003 birthday album. That's according to documents reviewed by the Wall Street Journal. And pages from the leather-bound album, assembled before Epstein was first arrested in 2006, are among the documents examined by Justice Department officials who investigated Epstein and Maxwell years ago. And that's according to people who have reviewed the pages. It's unclear if any of the pages are part of the Trump administration's recent review. So that's the context. Now we'll get on to what's in the letter. It says, the letter bearing Trump's name, which was reviewed by the Journal, is bawdy, like others in the album. By the way, I'd never really heard this word bawdy before, but there we go. I'm learning every day. It contains several lines of typewritten text framed by the outline of a naked woman, which appears to be hand-drawn with a heavy marker. A pair of small arcs denotes the woman's breasts, and the future president's signature is a squiggly Donald below her waist, mimicking pubic hair. The letter concludes, "Happy birthday, and may every day be another wonderful secret," which is probably the most incriminating part. Although I suppose signing your name as the pubic hair of an imaginary lady is also a little bit embarrassing. I'm not sure why they haven't just published the letter. I'd like to see a photocopy, but I suppose maybe a condition from the source was that they didn't do that. Trump's long-standing association with Jeffrey Epstein has, of course, long been suggested as a reason he may be less than keen to instruct the State Department to release all the files they have of the deceased convicted paedophile. So if this is a document that the State Department or the Justice Department does have, you can see why he might not be releasing all of those files. Trump, though, has come out fighting on his platform, Truth Social. So he says the Wall Street Journal printed a fake letter supposedly to Epstein. These are not my words, not the way I talk. Also, I don't draw pictures. I told Rupert Murdoch it was a scam and he shouldn't print this fake story, but he did. And now I'm going to sue his ass off and that of his third-rate newspaper. Thank you for your attention to this matter, DJT. I don't draw pictures is a slightly odd defense, also a dangerous one because it's quite easy to disprove. And Twitter today has been full of newspaper reports of Donald Trump having been a fan of doodling and signing doodles for sale. This sketch of the Empire State Building published in the New York Times after it was auctioned off was drawn by Trump in the 1990s. And someone called Annie Rawerda tweeted this. So she said, "I know this doesn't matter, but a lady in Ohio solicited doodles from celebrities to auction for charity. And in 2004, she said that Trump was always literally the first person to send in his drawings." You can see there his drawing, which seems to be in thick marker or thick felt pen, which I think the picture of the woman was supposed to be in. And this Twitter user, she wasn't bullshitting, so she shared the quote from a local Ohio newspaper. Donald Trump is the first doodle we've gotten back both years within 2 weeks, said the woman organizing this charity auction. Trump had another defense, though. He says, if there was a smoking gun on Epstein, why didn't the Dems, who controlled the files for 4 years and had Garland and Comey in charge, or why wouldn't they use it? Because they had nothing. I think this, or does it misunderstand it? I mean, if you're remotely credulous, you won't take this argument, because the whole point about the Epstein conspiracy theory is that it wasn't just, no one really thinks that it was about Epstein and Trump. It was about Epstein and the establishment, which included both Democrats, so Epstein clearly good friends, clearly associated, let's say, with the likes of Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, etc., but also associated with Donald Trump. So the reason the Democrats wouldn't have released this, according to the conspiracies, or according to the theories, I suppose, is not because, they thought they'd let Donald Trump off the hook. It's because they were also implicated. That's the whole point. So this particular defense, much like the one that he doesn't draw pictures, doesn't seem to stack up to me, really, which is perhaps why under pressure, Trump clearly has felt the need to appease his base. So on the Epstein issue, he has said this: based on the ridiculous amount of publicity given to Jeffrey Epstein, I have asked Attorney General Pom Bondi to produce any and all pertinent grand jury testimony subject to court approval. This scam perpetrated by the Democrats should end right now. Pam Bondi has agreed to produce grand jury testimony, but it's unclear how significant that particular concession really will be. Democratic Congressperson Daniel Goldman tweeted this: nice try, Pam Bondi. What about videos, photographs, and other recordings? What about FBI 302's witness interviews? What about texts and emails? That's where the evidence about Trump and others will be. Grand jury testimony will only relate to Epstein and Maxwell. So he's not impressed by this commitment to publish grand jury testimony. Well, to discuss the revelations and rows surrounding the Epstein files, I'm joined by investigative reporter Daniel Boguslaw, who has reported extensively on all of this. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's begin by talking about the Wall Street Journal revelations, I suppose their contents, and also the significance of the timing, the week in which they've been published.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. I have to say, when I first heard the summary of the Wall Street Journal reporting, I kind of had the instinct to think it was a nothing burger. This was not showing some kind of great new conspiracy. This was not delving deeper into the different conspiracy theories that have been floated, or the allegations that there was a very specific and high-tech blackmail operation being run. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this reporting really gets at the heart of the matter, which is association. And it shows that Trump was in this inner circle. He was called upon for Jeffrey Epstein's birthday to provide a friendly letter. In that letter, again, there's no specifics. There's no names that are named. There's no new information about clients or travel or political deals being made. But what is disclosed in that letter is a willingness to continue engaging with Epstein, a willingness to discuss or at least to depict a nude woman in a way that suggests a deeper knowledge of their shared proclivities for young women, which has been reported on extensively. And I think that this report actually gets at the heart of the matter, which is that, as you said earlier, members of both parties are implicated in this. How deep that implication goes remains unclear. But what we do know is that, as you said, people like Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, a whole slew of Republican operatives and politicians all had contact with Epstein and continued having contact with Epstein well after it was first made public that he was paying for sex with underage women. Now, we don't know entirely how much they knew before those first allegations in 2006, 2007. It's also very possible that they were close friends with him. They spent time with him in New York, spent time with him in Florida. And so it's a little hard to believe that there wasn't some foreknowledge of his behavior and his proclivities. But I think that ultimately, J.D. Vance has tweeted saying this is a nothing burger. I'm a bit ashamed to say that was my first gut reaction, but ultimately I really think that this gets to the root of the problem, which is that all these powerful people from the top highest 1% were all ingratiated with him and were called upon to write him dirty notes for his birthday.
Just to get clear on the timing, so as far as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, it was 2006 where it became sort of public knowledge what Epstein had done, because that's when the plea in Florida, or the conviction in Florida took place, and that sort of sweet plea bargain that he managed to get. This was in 2003, this letter. So, and I think Trump and Epstein fell out in 2004, not over the sort of pedophilia, which, maybe Trump's not that concerned about. It was over a real estate deal, I think, is why they fell out. But I suppose there is a lot of evidence that Trump had insight into the nature of Jeffrey Epstein. I suppose signing a birthday card, if this is real, with "here's to more secrets." I haven't got the exact words, but something along those lines. And then he also said, there's a quote from him from the early 2000s, isn't there, where he says, "Jeffrey Epstein, a great guy. He likes women almost as much as I do, and he really likes them younger, actually." So clearly Donald Trump was very aware of some degree of what Jeffrey Epstein was like.
Yeah, I think that's right. But it's also hard to imagine that everyone else wasn't also aware. And, there have been stateside that, there have been a lot of instances where people showed up. The former director of the CIA, Bill Burns, had to issue a public statement conveying his apologies for meeting with Epstein as he prepared to transition into the private sector. MIT, Harvard have been forced to return donations, all sorts of scientists who we met with. And, these people knew many of these meetings took place after his first conviction. And so, again, I think this really shows that once you reach a certain level of hard cash, people are willing to overlook almost anything. And he developed an extraordinary network. Being able to be the go-to networker fixer for the former CIA director who's looking for advice on how to transition to the private sector, having that type of access is incredible. And I think only happens when you have this sort of bipartisan appeal, which you've cultivated over years and years. And we know from the records, we know from Epstein's calendars that he spent a lot of time taking these meetings. I think it's unlikely that he was, filming people engaging in illegal sexual activity at all of these meetings. I think what's much more likely is that he managed very early on to ingratiate himself with powerful people and then kept that growth going year after year, decade after decade.
I want to come back to that, because I suppose there is another theory that he was an intelligence asset and that this was a kind of honey trap operation. But let's park that and come back to it in a moment, because I want to give the context of why this is all blown up in the last couple of weeks, in case sort of anyone's watching this thinking, why are we talking about Epstein again? Why is this a huge controversy in America all of a sudden? It was covered on Monday, but we'll give you a bit more here. Because this has all blown up after the Justice Department released a memo on the Epstein files about 10 days ago, I think, which came to this conclusion. So they said, this systematic review revealed no incriminating client list. There was also no credible evidence found that Epstein blackmailed prominent individuals as part of his actions. We did not uncover evidence that could predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties. So basically nothing to see here. The memo said the Justice Department had looked through 300 gigabytes of data, including a large volume of images and videos, but they said they wouldn't be releasing anything else into the public domain in case it re-traumatized victims or identified victims. One piece of video they did release was this footage of a part of the corridor leading to Epstein's prison cell on the night he died. And this is a quote from that memo. So it said, as the Department of Justice's Inspector General explained in 2023, anyone entering or attempting to enter the tier where Epstein's cell was located from the Special Housing Unit common area would have been captured by this footage. The FBI's independent review of this footage confirmed that from the time Epstein was locked in his cell at around 10:40 p.m. on August the 9th, 2019, until around 6:30 a.m. the next morning, nobody entered any of the tiers in the SHU, the Secure Housing Unit. Daniel, the memo is basically saying there's nothing to see here. We're not going to be showing you anymore. This is it. And I suppose that's why there's been so much pushback, because people are saying, I've still got loads of questions. Many people in the MAGA orbit had been telling them that there was an enormous conspiracy. And now they've basically said, actually, nothing to see. And also, we're not showing you anything else. That's why this has blown up. Do you find this memo convincing? It's quite short. It's just sort of 2 pages. And basically says, this is it. Forget about it.
No, I don't find it convincing. And in fact, there's so much evidence that has yet to be released. I'm struggling to even organize the summary in my head, but I'll try to speed run it for you right now. Starting in 2006 through 2007, there was first a local police investigation into Epstein. The police chief in Palm Beach believed that the political pressure on his department was so great that he needed federal help. He basically handed over all of his information to the FBI. The FBI took up the investigation. And despite the fact that we can see in later public reviews of that FBI operation that they were extremely hungry to arrest and prosecute Epstein, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida, which was ultimately overseeing the prosecution for that original 2006-2007 case, ultimately completely stonewalled. They acquiesced to extraordinary demands from Epstein's attorneys. Epstein's attorneys engaged in an unprecedented pressure campaign on that U.S. Attorney's Office. They researched prosecutors' family members. They consistently badgered the office. They went over the Southern District's head to the DOJ HQ in Washington, D.C. And ultimately, they secured a plea deal, which not only allowed Epstein to evade federal charges, pleading instead to state charges, he was allowed to serve his time in a work release program. And most critically, he was given a non-prosecution agreement, which barred his victims from bringing further claims against him. Now, so we have one bucket there. Let's put that as bucket number 1, 2006, 2007. We have all the investigative materials from the FBI, which are so heavily redacted and only partially released that they're completely inscrutable. We have all the communications. We have some summary of some of those communications from an internal DOJ review, but not the hard documents. What we also don't have is the decades, about 2 decades worth of sealed information from what the DOJ says is over 1,000 victims who have brought various civil claims. All of that information is under seal. And then, of course, we have the famous raid in 2018 on Epstein's townhouse, where they seized laptops, they seized hard drives, and all of those documents are under seal. In some cases, I think there's also been reports that some of them mysteriously disappeared. So over the span of 20 years, there has been the ongoing production of documents related to Jeffrey Epstein. And the notion that the DOJ has nothing to release is hands down an attempt to squash the story, because there's all sorts of things they could release. As we saw this week, yesterday, Pam Bondi said, okay, we're going to try to open up some of the sealed grand jury testimony. Now, that's, again, one very small portion of the total documents. We don't know which grand jury testimony, if it's more than one grand jury testimony. What we do know is that that's probably not going to include the voluminous digital and paper records that exist, that were seized both in 2006 and later in 2018. So the notion that there's nothing to release has already been disproven by Trump's DOJ. And I think that given the way they've handled this so far, it's unlikely that whatever grand jury testimony is released is going to satisfy the masses in both parties who are hungry to learn more.
There's 2 ways this is being reported in the liberal media, which is sort of Trump's crew, not necessarily Donald Trump himself, because he's always been quite dismissive of the Epstein issue, but sort of people in the MAGA circle whipped up Donald Trump's base to sort of buy into this conspiracy theory. And now MAGA is in power and they've got sort of nothing to show for themselves. And it's a bit embarrassing for them. And this is a story about a divide within a electoral coalition, let's say. The other analysis, though, is that we are seeing a real cover-up here. There is a lot that we should know that we aren't being told because Donald Trump is implicated. So it's not that sort of these conspiracy theorists have been shown that the conspiracy wasn't true. It's actually the conspiracy goes even deeper than we had once thought, because it now includes Donald Trump, contra to all the QAnon theories, where he would be the one individual who would be able to out the pedophile rings. So I suppose on the substantive issue of, are we seeing a cover-up because too many people are implicated? Is that what you think is going on here? Should we be outraged?
I certainly would be. I certainly think we should be. I think that, if, again, going back to a point you made at the very beginning of this segment, the reality is that for a long time, members of both parties at the highest level, be they elected officials or the donor class that supports those elected officials with unlimited campaign funds, have been heavily implicated on both sides. And so I think Trump's latest spiel is that surely if there was incriminating evidence, Democratic administrations would have released this. But the reality is that the former leaders of the party, be it the Clintons or be it the donor class who fund those leaders, are both implicated and honestly want the same thing that Trump wants, which is just to make it all go away. Now, I think there's one very interesting component, which the New York Times has been covering this week, which kind of broke out into the news and was shocking to me, which comes from the office of Senator Ron Wyden. He's a long-standing civil liberties champion. He's fought the FBI 702 surveillance authority for many years. He's also had his hands bound for many years and often has to do these sort of press releases where, he talks about what his committee is investigating in very general terms because of the nature of classification and the reality that if he discloses classified information or information under seal, he won't be able to continue those investigations. But what he spoke on this week to the New York Times was the fact that for the past 3 years, he's been looking into flagged banking reports of over $1 billion of transactions that Epstein touched that were flagged by the biggest banks in the world for suspicious activity. And, I think there's no better proof than that this implicates the 1% who are more than willing to throw money towards either party, depending on who's listening and which side their bread is buttered on that week. So I think we're going to start seeing more cracks like this. Epstein touched a lot of different industries. He touched a lot of different people. He touched a lot of different political demographics. And I think it's interesting to see the Democrats, especially younger Democrats who don't have the same allegiances to that older political leadership class and donor class, starting to come out and say, yeah, this is ridiculous. We are the champions of a movement that's trying to distance ourselves from that legacy of the Democratic Party and are continuing to keep the pressure on. So I think that whether it's out of Wyden's committee, more information about these banking reports and the elites that Epstein was trading money for and helping to evade taxes, whether it's direct pressure on Trump in the court system, whether it's advocacy for the lawyers who are continuing to represent Epstein's victims as they seek to have records requests under the Freedom of Information Act released. There's a lot of avenues. Again, there are so many documents in so many different places that there's a lot of ways to try to pry them out. And I think the biggest determinative factor of how much we get is how effective political leaders and people in the media are at continuing to prioritize this as an issue of interest.
The thing that wasn't in the memo, in the 2-page memo from the Justice Department that wasn't mentioned at all, which in a way I'm most interested in, is the claims that Epstein was an intelligence asset, so either for the US or for Israel. And to my mind, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest this might have been the case. So no one can really explain where he got all of his money from. He just has all these fantastic properties everywhere, and his professional career seems to be fairly unremarkable. Ghislaine Maxwell's dad, Robert Maxwell, was most likely a Mossad agent of some sort or another. And then Alexander Acosta, who was the prosecutor in Florida, when asked, and this is according to reporting in the Daily Beast, when asked why he gave Jeffrey Epstein such a sweet plea deal, said, he was told by the intelligence community that this guy was an asset and so he should go, tread lightly. Do we know anything more about whether or not Jeffrey Epstein was an intelligence asset? And is that sort of the real cover-up that we're missing here?
Well, I'll give my personal perspective, which might annoy some people. I think when I talk about my experience reporting on intelligence agencies, it doesn't always match up with James Bond or the popular imagination. In my experience, having known sources who have worked in some capacity as a confidential human source, oftentimes people who are willing to work in an undercover capacity where they are being duplicitous and feeding information back to domestic or foreign intelligence services often have a very unique mentality. They often like the feeling that they, are a secret agent, even if the information they're communicating is very rudimentary or if the reason they are serving as a CHS is to try to, dampen some other part of their lifestyle, which they can't control, whether that's sex addiction or drug addiction or gambling problems. So, I mean, if there was any truth to this idea that he was connected to U.S. or Israeli intelligence, the idea that he was on the payroll, I think, is very unlikely to me. That's just not really how. It's just not how either of those intelligence services operate in the context of someone like him. What I think is probably more likely is that he could have been debriefed, certainly by the CIA, for example. I mean, the CIA engages in debriefings all the time when Americans travel abroad and take high-profile meetings. They'll contact people and interview them and try to understand what they saw and what they heard. Given Epstein's personality and what we know about him, I think it's very plausible that he would have spread that rumor around to try to, incentivize more wealthy banking elite to come and use his services. There's an incredible revolving door in the United States between the Central Intelligence Agency and Wall Street because they're both information traders and they both prioritize information, one for profit and one for so-called national security. One quote in the Daily Beast, sure, Maxwell's connections are very suspect. But again, I think that it's very plausible that he was debriefed. It's very plausible that he gave constant reports to these agencies. But, was this all some state-sanctioned operation? At the root, was his motivation a honeypot operation? I find that hard to believe, having looked at some other honeypot operations in the past.
Oh, we've got to talk to you another time about the actual, or the honeypot operations that you've confirmed. Let's end by talking about the politics of this. Some Democrats are sensing an opportunity after Vice President J.D. Vance lashed out at the Wall Street Journal for publishing the story on Trump. AOC said, "Why are you fighting back against releasing what your administration and the Department of Justice knows about Epstein? Release the unedited video and the files. Bring it to light. That should clear everything up." Nancy Pelosi, though, has a different perspective.
Whether it's Jeffrey Epstein or Alcatraz, it's all off the subject of what they're doing with this budget that is harmful to the kitchen table, meeting the kitchen table needs of the American people.
I want to make sure I understand what you mean when you say distraction. Do you think that Pam Bondi going to Alcatraz is meant potentially as a distraction from Epstein, which has not gone over well at all with the president's base?
No, I think they're both distractions.
They're both distractions. I think here, I suppose what Democrats, Daniel, are sensing, or some of them, the ones with better political antennae, are that this is an issue where Donald Trump's base genuinely is really divided and they're sort of ripping each other's hair out, and that it's probably a good thing to take advantage of this, as well as trying to get justice for the people who were abused by Jeffrey Epstein. You've got other people in the Democratic establishment basically echoing Donald Trump and saying nothing to see here. Where do you think this is going to go?
Well, I think it's going to continue. Again, I think this goes back to a generational divide within the Democratic Party. Nancy Pelosi believes that highly educated elites with lots of money have a right to that education and that money, and therefore should decide the direction of the party and the fate of hundreds of millions of Americans. A younger generation of Democrats don't believe that's the case. And I think what they're tapping into is not just a sort of true crime fascination with the gruesome details of the Jeffrey Epstein case, but something much larger, something much more diffuse. The fact that they can sense, that the American populace, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, can sense that wealth accumulation, elite governance, and the concentration of power in the hands of an extremely small elite is bad for America and bad for their lives. And whether that feeling manifests in voting for Donald Trump, whether that feeling manifests in voting for Bernie Sanders, whether that feeling manifests in demanding the release of information about a man who we know was hobnobbing with the 1% of America and indeed the world, young progressive Democrats are tuning into that. And I think they are seeing that the Epstein saga is one part of a larger political movement to hold the powerful accountable and to try to reduce the ability for that class of people to consistently live their lives according to a separate set of rules. The last point I just wanted to make about a Rolling Stone piece I published this week is that, I reported this week that Epstein not only managed to apply extraordinary pressure to the U.S. Attorney's Office, but he also paid for private investigators to detail the low-level FBI case agents who were investigating him. And again, I think what that shows is an ability to reach both the highest levels of justice in America and also the lowest level of, working people who are trying to do right and follow those laws. And I think that same phenomenon, pitting the FBI, the investigative force, against the Ivy-educated attorneys of the DOJ is playing out at the highest levels. You have Pam Bondi kind of backing Trump, willing to bend the knee to his every whim. And then you have people like Deputy Director Dan Bongino and FBI Director Kash Patel, who really made their bones slamming the FBI and this idea of an elite system of governance. And, Dan Bongino last week refused to show up to work because he was so upset over the disclosures. So I think really, to summarize what this is all about, is the powerful versus the weak, the elite versus the people, and the boiling, roiling rage of everyday citizens who want an explanation for why their world looks the way it is.
Keir Starmer has finally announced a policy I quite like.
I think it's really important that 16 and 17-year-olds have the vote because they're old enough to go out to work, they're old enough to pay taxes, so to pay in. And I think if you pay in, you should have the opportunity to say what you want your money spent on, which way the government should go. So I'm really pleased that we're able to bring more young people into our democracy and give them the chance to have a say over how their taxes are going to be paid and what they're going to be used for.
Yes, Keir Starmer has announced that 16 and 17-year-olds will be able to vote in the next general election. And this has been portrayed in the right-wing media as sort of a desperate attempt by Keir Starmer to try and get re-elected because he has bad poll ratings. Now, I think that's quite a disingenuous argument because this was in the manifesto. So it's difficult to call it undemocratic when it was in the manifesto. Starmer's argument there saying, well, people can pay tax, so they should be able to vote. I suppose the reason why I think this is important is a demographic one, actually, which is that I think that in this country, politics is too shifted towards older people. And I don't think, I think older people hate younger people. I don't think we need to have a generational war about this, but I do think that people tend to take their own personal situation more into account than they vote than other people's situations. And I think the fact that we have very much an aging population does mean that politics is more directed towards the interests of older people than the interests of younger people, which means sort of it's easier to cut money for education or youth centres than it is, say, the triple lock on pensions, for example. I'm not saying we should cut the triple lock on pensions. I'm just saying that I think any politician will tell you that they're much more scared of older people than they are of younger people. And I don't think that's particularly healthy for the future of a country. I mean, as you might know, if you've watched this show for a while, I've had arguments. I would go further. I think that, maybe everyone over 14 should have the vote and everyone under 14, their parents should be able to get to vote on their behalf. I think it's really important that we shift politics in this country so that the voices of younger people are heard more, right? I think that the fact that renting is so expensive is an issue that goes under the radar because there are fewer young people and young people don't really vote. I think this feeds into the problem that it's too difficult to have kids because actually most people who are voting had kids a very long time ago. There aren't even it's not just that sort of teenagers aren't a large part of the electorate. It's that people under sort of in their 30s aren't a large part of the electorate either. So I think shifting the electorate so that it's a little bit younger, thinking a bit more about the future. Not that old people can't think about the future again. I'm not trying to typecast anyone. I'm just saying, what do people on average tend to take into account when they're voting? It tends to be their own pocketbook. And I think that having a spread which is more representative of young people would be very positive, which is why I support this. Even though it's not going to be revolutionary, I think it will sort of increase the electorate by maybe 3%. And based on the fact that young people vote less, maybe 2%. So it's unlikely to flip a general election anytime soon. In any case, though, the right are furious. This was Julia Hartley-Brewer on Talk Radio.
Just some breaking news for you. I mean, just when you think things couldn't get any worse. You know how 16 and 17-year-olds, are they're now trusted to have sex, and they can have, sex with someone of the same sex. That was banned for many years. Not allowed to buy cigarettes, not allowed to buy vapes, not allowed to buy a pint or a glass of wine in the pub. That would be illegal. And why? Well, because we don't really trust those people to make those decisions. Not allowed to get married. Not allowed to get married under the age of 18 either these days anymore. Required to stay in full-time educational training of some sort at the age of 16 and 17. However, as of the next election, as just confirmed in the news from the government today, 16 and 17-year-olds will be allowed to vote for the first time across the whole of the UK. This brings the whole country in line with Scottish and Welsh elections. We're going to let kids vote. Brilliant.
I mean, the sort of the outcry about how wrong this could go, because obviously the reason we don't let kids smoke or drink is because it's really bad for them, right? It's really bad for them. It can have lifelong effects. If we only let 16 and 17-year-olds vote and we didn't let anyone else vote, yeah, I think that could lead to some bad consequences, because obviously you don't have as much experience when you're 16 and 17 as you do when you're 50 or 60 or whatever. But making 3% of the electorate 16 to 17, to me, seems like a good idea. Yeah, they might not have as many experiences. They might not know as much as a 40-year-old, but also they do have, in some ways, a bigger stake in the future because they're going to be around for more of it, right? It's probably going to be harder to raise tuition fees. It's probably going to be harder to, as I said before, cut youth services if you've got to appeal to a broader section of the population. So I'm very much in favour of this. Again, I feel like the way people are talking about this makes it seem as if only 16 and 17-year-olds are going to vote. And so therefore politics is going to go wildly out of control instead of serving as a bit of a corrective to a politics which is, I think, very much sort of geared towards, it's not about age actually, so older people, but also property owners. Obviously, young people are much less likely to own property than older people. The Telegraph are simply sick of hearing young people's opinions.
The rationale for this is, various MPs said, that, in fact, the whole session had the air of a meeting of the Youth Parliament, that 16 and 17-year-olds are desperate to get involved. They are the future. That phrase was used a great deal. And we must give the younger generation a say. Now, of course, I wanted to scream from the gallery, if they just wait 2 years, yes, they can have a say. They can have that. Also, they're having a say the whole time on social media. We don't stop hearing from these people. Some of them are children. Yeah. They start turning up at COP climate conferences like Greta Thunberg. We all have to listen to them. Then they get in boats and get involved in the Middle East. I mean, we've had it up to here with, frankly, children pretending to be adults.
No, I'm sure there's an element of satire there. I think there was, I'm not sure if that was the sincerest comment one could possibly develop there by Camilla Tominey. But I do still think it's wildly wrong, even if it wasn't even if it was said partly in jest. I do think that young people don't have nearly enough influence over politics at the moment. Not nearly enough, right? And the idea that people have too many opinions because they're saying stuff on Instagram. Sure, they might be saying stuff on Instagram, but they don't really have any political impact because our population is getting older and older and older, and young people don't turn out to vote quite so much, right? You say, well, then why are you demanding that 16 and 17-year-olds have the vote? Well, if 50% of them vote, that's still going to make the electorate a little bit younger, which I think is going to be good for making not just life better for younger people, but also people who want to raise kids, instead of people who already have grandkids, for example. Obviously, they should be able to vote as well. Everyone should be able to vote. But I do think that structurally we will get into a problem, actually I was going to say in the West, but across the world, with aging populations and falling birth rates, where just young people are very poorly represented. And then you can get into a bit of a doom loop where society gets worse and worse for young people. And when I say young people, I include people in their 30s, really, when it comes to the electorate. And that means that fewer and fewer people have kids. And that you can see how that doom loop would play out in practice. So Keir Starmer, well done. And it seems like this is something he's not going to U-turn on. So there we go. A good news story about Keir Starmer. Of course, it doesn't outweigh the bad ones. But there we go. We're as fair as we can be. Diane Abbott has been suspended from the Labour Party again.
You got into terrible trouble for a letter you wrote to The Observer about racism. And you appeared to suggest, in the view of some of your critics anyway, that the kind of anti-Semitism that the Jewish community suffered, or travellers suffered, or Irish people suffered, was somehow different from the racism that you as a young black person had suffered. You were suspended and there was a great hoo-ha. Do you look back on that with regret?
No, not at all. Clearly, there must be a difference between racism which is about colour and other types of racism, because you can see a traveller or a Jewish person walking down the street. You don't know. You don't know unless you stop to speak to them or you're in a meeting with them. But if you see a black person walking down the street, you see straight away that they're black. They are different types of racism.
So those comments were made in an interview with the BBC. It was recorded, I think, much earlier this year, actually, but just published this week or published yesterday. Diane Abbott was immediately re-suspended. It's a difficult one. I mean, obviously, she shouldn't have been suspended. But in terms of what was said in that interview, everything she said about different types of racism, I think, is entirely correct. Of course, racism is different depending on whether a stranger can tell you're of a different race, right? A black person is racialized a lot more often than a Jewish person when they're walking down the street. I think that's just obviously true. And that means it will come with different challenges. I think the mistake was to say she had no regrets about the original letter she sent to the Observer, which did go further than saying different types of racisms are different. This is her full letter, just to remind you. So it said, Tamiwa Owolade claims that Irish, Jewish and traveller people all suffer from racism. So this was in response to an article by him. They undoubtedly experience prejudice. This is similar to racism, and the two words are often used as if they are interchangeable. It is true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice, but they are not all their lives subject to racism. In pre-civil rights America, Irish people, Jewish people and travellers were not required to sit at the back of the bus. In apartheid South Africa, these groups were allowed to vote. And at the height of slavery, there were no white-seeming people manacled on the slave ships. I mean, as we said at the time, again, I don't think she should have been suspended for it, but a number of things wrong with that letter. I suppose because in this letter, she's saying that Jewish people, Irish people and traveller people don't suffer from racism, essentially. She's saying they suffer from prejudice, which she compares to prejudice against redheads. I also think it's strange to give a sort of brief potted history of racism in the 20th century and before the 20th century, because she's talking about the height of slavery, but miss out the Holocaust, which is obviously a large event of industrial racism or racism on an industrial scale. So to miss that out and sort of suggest that all the material forms of racism are against people based on their skin color. It was a bad letter. Basically, it was a bad letter. I think everything she said in that interview, on the face of it, was fine, but I don't know why she said she had no regrets about a letter, which she went on to apologize for anyway. I suppose it's difficult to read people's minds, isn't it? Whatever the case, though, I think Keir Starmer is just suspending people willy-nilly very easily. And the discourse around all this does drive me up the wall. For example, this was Robert Peston on ITV News.
She basically said she had no regrets, and she continued to repeat this idea that somehow, she would say the lived experience as a black person of racism is different, for example, from the racism that somebody like me who's a Jew would have experienced. Now, most people would say you should never say that there's a hierarchy of racism, and that the implication of what she said is that there's a hierarchy. I'm sure she would deny that that's what she meant, but that's what came across, and that's why the Labour Party has suspended her again.
Maybe I'm being unfair here, but just watching that and seeing Robert Peston, who most people, I did know he was Jewish actually, but only sort of after he hosted a Jewish Labour movement hustings or something along those lines, right? I don't think that throughout his career he will have been particularly read as anything other than a white guy in the media, right? One of the most powerful journalists in the country saying, essentially, how dare Diane Abbott, the most abused politician in the country, say that the racism she's experienced is different from the racism I've experienced. Like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's received lots of, credible death threats because of his Jewish background. Clearly, there's a lot of violent racism in his family history. I think he's got ancestors or relatives who died in the Holocaust, right? But the idea that his life experience and Diane Abbott's life experience can be sort of meaningfully compared and say that their experience of racism is basically the same. When to most people walking down the street, Robert Peston is a white guy, right? A white guy in a very dominant position in the media. Like, I just don't think his experience of racism will be remotely similar to Diane Abbott. So to sort of do all this hand-wringing, most people will think it's outrageous that Diane Abbott has suggested that her experience of racism might be different from my experience of racism, me, Robert Peston. I really think most people watching that will think, I thought Robert Peston experiences racism? Really? I mean, I'm not saying he hasn't. Maybe he has, right? But I think this idea that what Diane Abbott said in the second interview, as I say, I think the original letter which she said, the original letter was silly, was wrong. Saying she didn't regret it was stupid, I think. But everyone's sort of wringing their hands saying, how dare you say that the racism faced by black people is different to the racism faced by someone like Robert Peston. I just think is somewhat discrediting. The Oscar-nominated director Petra Costa has a new film out on Netflix on the relationship between the evangelical church and the radical right in Brazil. It's a really excellent film. It's eye-opening. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Here's part of the trailer.
This city was designed as a vision of Brazil's future. And the cement that held it together was a faith, not in God, but instead in the equally abstract ideas of progress and democracy.
Eu quero ser pastor de uma geração que vai mudar a história.
In the last 40 years, evangelicals have grown from 5 to more than 30% of Brazil's population. A rapid religious shift molded into an unprecedented political force.
No meu voto, o que vai influenciar mesmo é a minha religião.
Somos maioria absoluta no país. O que levou o socialismo ao fracasso foi a negação da religião.
Com verdade, nós estamos fazendo uma nova forma política no Brasil.
É que ele gosta de conversar comigo também, porque eu também sou franco para falar com ele.
Brasil, acima de tudo, Deus acima de tudo.
That was part of the trailer for Apocalypse in the Tropics. It's the follow-up to Petra Costa's Oscar-nominated film, The Edge of Democracy. And The Edge of Democracy gave viewers a front-row seat to the judicial coup, which saw Dilma Rousseff kicked out of office and Lula barred from standing in the 2019 presidential election. And of course, that election was won by Bolsonaro. And this new film looks at the movement behind Bolsonaro and in particular the support it drew from evangelicals. It climaxes with the presidential election in 2022, which saw Lula return to power and Brazil's, or the ham-fisted attempt of Brazil's right at a January 6th style coup. Earlier this month, I caught up with Petra Costa to discuss the film, and I began by asking her what led her to focus on the evangelical right.
I'm Brazilian, and I'm very interested for the past 10 years in understanding what has been happening to Brazilian democracy. Brazil is the largest population of Latin America, and as you know, the future of the world depends on it because we have the Amazon most of the Amazon within our borders. So who governs Brazil also will influence how our ecosystems survive. And I went to Congress trying to understand what was happening to Brazilian democracy and was met by a pastor who asked me to accept Jesus and gave me a Bible. And the contradiction of going into the center of democracy and being evangelized or invited to be evangelized was what set me into this journey, into a rabbit hole of trying to understand how faith has been mobilized for political reasons in Brazil and around the world.
And I suppose the film documents, doesn't it, the role of the evangelical church in the rise of Bolsonaro. Do you think that we wouldn't have seen a Bolsonaro without the evangelical church having become so significant in Brazilian politics?
Yes, I think the evangelical support was crucial for Bolsonaro's election because that's the majority of the working class vote that he got in the beginning and still continued to get comes from a part of the evangelical population. As we saw in the last election, 2022, the evangelical population was this segment that most voted for him. 70% of evangelicals voted for Bolsonaro, more than in any other social-political segment. And many evangelical leaders most of the prominent evangelical leaders continue very aligned with Bolsonaro and the far right.
The film's about Brazilian politics. It's also about religion. And I suppose a question which applies in many parts of the world, really. is how different religions or different sort of, I suppose, types of religion, different schools of thought can lead to different politics. And it is really interesting, isn't it, how evangelical Christianity has been so associated with the right wing. In your documentary, you sort of briefly discuss liberation theology, which was part of the Catholic Church, which was very much about, I suppose, uplifting the poor and fighting for democracy. So what is your analysis of why evangelical Christianity has been so allied with the right? Is there something doctrinal there? Is there something sort of about the belief system that means it naturally supports right-wing politics? Or is this a sort of sociological situation where it just so happens that the people at the forefront of the evangelical church have supported politicians of the right?
I think it has to do a lot with premillennialism and what I trace in the film as the origin of this thought, which is that for much time Christians believed that Jesus would return to the earth after 1,000 years of peace on earth. And John Nelson Darby, this Irish pastor, changed that in the 19th century by saying that no, actually the world was in chaos and Jesus would come back the more things were in a state of chaos and collapse. And some fundamentalist evangelicals who come after this theology of Darby would even radicalize that to the point of saying that the end of the world must be accelerated for Jesus to return. I myself interviewed a pastor who said that very clearly. When I asked him, why did he vote for Bolsonaro? He said, well, Bolsonaro is bringing chaos in many ways, but that's good because the faster things get into the apocalypse, the faster Jesus will return. And we're seeing that in America very clearly with this end times theology being very present among Trump's allies and many people in his very close to him in his government. And it is also this idea of waging war in the Middle East has all to do with that theology of that there will be an Armageddon that must be accelerated for Jesus to return. And I was unaware that this theology was driving my national politics and world politics to such an extent.
It's disconcerting, isn't it, to have a religious movement which proactively wants chaos. I suppose a question I have is whether you have an analysis of why the evangelical church has been so successful. You point out in your movie, evangelicals went from 5% to 30% of the Brazilian population in the past 40 years. And you say it's one of the fastest religious shifts in human history. Why has the evangelical church sort of grown so dramatically in Brazil and in elsewhere? Obviously, people will know about the United States, I think also in East Asia and in many parts of the world, actually, much of Africa, the evangelical church has been on the rise. Is there something about evangelical Christianity that's particularly suited to the modern world, that it's seen as particularly attractive or particularly capable of spreading itself? What's your analysis of why it seems, I suppose, suited to the current moment, let's say?
Well, first, there's much less hierarchy. A pastor can open a church very quickly in any area. In a country like Brazil, it's very hard for a Catholic church to go to the Amazon or to remote areas of Brazil, while evangelical pastors can get formed more quickly, open a church in their own houses. And also prosperity theology is very aligned with neoliberalism, with capitalism, with the idea that you can and should enrich yourself. That is not a sin. In Brazil, particularly, the rise of evangelicalism had a lot to do with a moment where many Brazilians were being expelled or forced out of rural areas and were encroaching in the cities, were starting to live in the favelas, and Brazil was becoming extremely unequal. And the evangelical church started to play a role also of social services, of belonging, of giving people a family in these new places. Today, what I saw in making this film was also the role they play in political formation and personal coaching. Malafaia, the pastor that we followed for 4 years, in his services, he will say, you will be the generation that will change the world. You're going to be the judges, the Supreme Court, justices, the presidents of tomorrow. Who else says that to young people today? I mean, I never heard anything like that when I was growing up. And it's powerful. It's powerful to hear something like that. And I think what is clear in Brazil particularly is that the place progressive movements, progressive religious movements occupied in the country's social fabric has diminished immensely. And as well as other type of social movements that do grassroots work. Most of the grassroots work are done by evangelical pastors.
Where does this analysis lead you? Because I mean, in the documentary, the evangelical church are portrayed as, you know, a malign influence really on Brazilian politics. They're supporting a politician in the shape of Bolsonaro who is offensive, flirts with dictatorship, is very anti-democratic, and is willing to put the army out onto the streets. And that's very much supported by the very powerful evangelical Christians that you are following in the film. How would a democracy-loving leftist respond to this? Does the left need a sort of religion of its own? Does it need to engage in evangelical spaces and try and take it in a different direction? I suppose, did you come away from making your film with an idea of what has to be the strategy to protect democracy in Brazil?
Well, in terms of strategy to protect democracy in Brazil and around the world is a clear understanding that the separation between church and state is at risk and under attack, and that democracy is a living thing and not take it for granted, and that it's urgent to establish mechanisms in our democracies that will protect the separation of church and state. And that and control the influence of religion over politics, of religious leaders in political campaigns. Also, an understanding that there are, of course, millions of evangelical followers who are not happy with this, that are not happy that their leaders are making so many services about politics and also persecuting religious followers who are not aligned with their political vision, as the pastor that I show in the film, who was expelled from his church and also persecuted for declaring that he would not vote in Bolsonaro. That is the case with many other pastors. That there are many pastors who are progressive, evangelical pastors who are progressive in Brazil, but that are under attack. And that is clearly a consequence of this attack on the separation of church and state. That's what happens. And that's the reason why Christians invented the separation of church and state. I was amazed to discover that it was not an atheist who invented that separation. It was Christians to stop centuries of religious wars, because that's the religious will be the first to be attacked once there is a state religion.
I want to talk about the connection between I'm not sure if it was your first film, actually, let's say your last film, The Edge of Democracy, and this most recent film, because the theme of The Edge of Democracy was very much sort of the judicial coup against Lula and Dilma. And in that, I felt like sort of the separation of powers was posited as, you know, to some degree malign. And the courts were to some degree malign. In your second movie, the courts play a much more, I suppose, they're presented as playing a much more positive role in terms of limiting the unconstrained power of Bolsonaro, who wants to take the country back into a dictatorship. Have your views on the courts sort of changed in the period of making both of these movies?
The Brazilian court went through a lot of self-criticism in the past few years. During the years that I was filming The Edge of Democracy, there was the car wash operation was done in a moment where there was this idea that the public ministry would rid Brazil of corruption, even if it had to disrespect the presumption of innocence and the rule of law. After that, many things happened, but mainly Vaza Jato, which were these leaks that showed Judge Sérgio Moro conspiring with the prosecutor, Deltan Dallagnol, to imprison Lula with the clear objective of not allowing him to win the presidential election. Then, as this judge went on to become Justice Minister of Bolsonaro, making the plot even more evident. After that, the Supreme Court went through a moment of deep self-criticism for its unconditional support of an operation that was clearly disrespecting the rule of law. So as I say, democracy is a living thing. Brazil went through a punitivist moment. Of course, there was corruption, and there were great things that happened after car wash, like forbidding companies to fund political campaigns. That was a direct consequence of that. But as any living thing, it self-regulates when it's healthy. And that's what I believe happened in the courts.
What direction do you see Brazilian politics going in? Obviously, sort of when you were making your first movie, it was quite a dark movie, right? Because democracy was being threatened by this judicial coup against Dilma and Lula. Your second movie, in a way, or even darker, right? Because it's about the Evangelical Church and Bolsonaro really threatening democracy. At the same time, it's being released at a time when Lula is in power, Bolsonaro did lose. There was it wasn't quite a peaceful transition of power, but there was a transition of power. What direction do you see Brazilian politics going in?
It's so unpredictable. It can go in any direction. But what is clear is that the far right has a strong wind blowing in this current zeitgeist around the world, because I believe many people feel that democracy is failing us, that neoliberalism is broken, that our leaders are trying to lead us into apocalypse or have no instruments to stop it. And so we need a fix in the system globally. We need a fix in the system to be able to become healthy democracies again.
That was Petra Costa speaking to me about her film Apocalypse in the Tropics, which is out now on Netflix, released at the start of this week. I do recommend it. Really enjoyed that film and the previous film from Petra Costa, The Edge of Democracy, which I presume is still available on Netflix. That's it for tonight. Anyway, we'll be back on Monday at 6 p.m. So have a fantastic weekend. For now, you've been watching Novara Live. Good night.